Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea on course for another day with more than 5,000 new cases of COVID-19, despite the vast majority of the population being fully vaccinated. The number of critically ill also straining the healthcare system to breaking point. The leaders of South Korea and Australia set for a post-summit press conference in Canberra. President Moon there on a 4-day state visit. The main focus of their talks, bolstering cooperation in carbon neutrality and the hydrogen economy. Plus, South Korea's top diplomat meets briefly with his counterpart from Japan on the sidelines of the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Liverpool. We have more on what was discussed.
Hello and welcome to this Monday edition of New Day at Arirang. It's 8 a.m. on December 13th here in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us. I'm Oh Soo-young, filling in this week for Kim Morgan.
It's wonderful to have you with us, Soo-young. I'm Mark Broom. Over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on the issues facing Korea and the world. As per usual, we're afraid. We start with the COVID-19 situation here in South Korea. From today, various measures will be implemented as part of the country's COVID-19 exit strategy.
And for more on this and other related updates, joining us is our reporter Shin Yeun. Good morning.
Good morning.
And well, Yeun, let's start with the number of new infections that we're expecting for today.
All right. Well, Soo-young, we're expecting to see Monday's caseload hover around the 5,000 mark. Up to 9 p.m. yesterday, a total of 4,564 cases of the virus were confirmed. What's more worrisome than the daily figures we're expecting, though, is that from today is the number of critically ill patients. On Sunday, we saw this number go as high as 894, the first time that reached this high. And accordingly, the country has reported concerns over its medical capacity. As of Saturday, 5 p.m., more than 80% of all hospital beds were in use. The Seoul and Incheon areas specifically have seen a shortage, with 9 out of 10 beds being used.
Right, so this is a serious problem, and last week the authorities introduced measures to try and remedy this, make it a little bit less of a strain on the healthcare system. And we hear that new measures are going to be taking effect this week as well.
Right. Well, for starters, from today, anyone aged 18 to 59 who have been fully vaccinated for more than 3 months can reserve their booster shots. Amid the uptick in COVID-19 figures, authorities have decided to adjust the interval between primary and booster shots from what was previously 4 to 5 months to just 3 months. An administration of these booster shots will begin on Wednesday. Those over 60 do not have to make separate reservations, and if they visit a hospital or facility with leftover vaccines, they can receive a booster jab on the day. Now, this comes as authorities have been trying to administer boosters to more seniors. Health authorities have frequently cited that around half of critically ill cases and deaths among people over 60 were breakthrough infections. Also, starting on Monday, everyone has to show their vaccination status through the QR check-in system or hand in a negative PCR test result taken within the previous 2 days to gain entry to most public facilities. Now, this includes restaurants, cafes, and movie theaters. Last week, authorities extended these so-called vaccine passes to most businesses and venues and also enforced a 1-week grace period to avoid any confusion. Now that this grace period has expired, though, businesses and individuals who violate these vaccine pass rules will be fined. Businesses can be fined up to a little over $2,500, and they may be hit with temporary or even permanent suspensions if they're found to have repeatedly violated rules. Individuals will also be fined around $85 if they don't abide by the rules.
Well, we're going to have to make sure that we stick by those rules and avoid that fine, Yeun. But, well, speaking of vaccine passes, though, there's been authorities have been trying to boost the number of teenagers getting vaccinated. Currently, it's around 37% for children in the 12 to 17 age group. But it's raised a bit of controversy, though, hasn't it?
Right, it definitely has, and many have raised concerns that the extension of vaccine passes to teens was basically mandating vaccinations, and especially because the proof of vaccination would be required at libraries, academies, and cram schools where students typically go to study, and parents specifically pointed to potential side effects and health issues from COVID-19 vaccines. In response, authorities have tried to give reassurance using scientific evidence on the efficacy of vaccines. They're also set on launching an outreach vaccination program from Wednesday, where medical staff will visit schools to administer vaccines to students on site. And surveys on which schools and students would like to receive a jab wrapped up on Sunday, and it showed that more than 80,000 students from 8,374 schools had signed up.
Now, this Omicron variant is another step in the way of us eventually, we hope, returning to a degree of normal life. Tell us more about how far this new strain has spread here in Korea and around other parts of the world.
Right, so if I start here in Korea, we've seen a total of 90 Omicron cases, and we'll know just how much more the variant has spread within a few hours. The UK has been one of the worst Omicron-stricken countries in the world. As of Sunday, the tally reached 3,137. Omicron has been doubling every 2 to 3 days in the UK. And that's why Prime Minister Boris Johnson on Sunday urged for more active participation in the country's booster shot campaign. Take a listen.
No one should be in any doubt. There is a tidal wave of Omicron coming, and I'm afraid it is now clear that 2 doses of vaccine are simply not enough to give the level of protection we all need. But the good news is that our scientists are confident that with a 3rd dose, a booster dose, we can all bring our level of protection back up.
Meanwhile, Israel has also been seeing an uptick in Omicron cases. It added 22 more infections on Sunday, bringing the total to 55. Amid the spread of Omicron, the number of daily COVID-19 infections in the country also jumped from the 400s back to the 700s. And that's why the Israeli government has decided to toughen restrictions. Authorities said they would determine which country to add to their red list of countries where travel is to and from is banned. On a daily basis, they'll review which country should be added. And Israel also decided to extend its Green Pass restrictions, which are basically vaccine passes, and they will be extended to shopping malls, barring entry for any unvaccinated Israelis.
All right, Yeon. Well, thank you very much for your report. See you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. South Korea's new COVID-19 infections were under 7,000 for the second straight day Sunday, but critical cases hit yet another all-time high, almost 900 on Sunday. Now, concerns are rising about this situation putting a very serious strain on South Korea's healthcare system. There's also the continued spread, as we just heard from our Shinya in there, of this new Omicron variant.
And from today, a 1-week grace period is no more. The vaccine pass system is applied to restaurants, cafes, private education academies and internet cafes. Businesses found to be in breach of these rules will also face big fines. And for more, we connect to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Ms. Medi Women's Hospital in Seoul. Now, hello, Dr. Tan. It's lovely to see you again. And well, Doctor, over 81% of people in South Korea have been fully vaccinated, with around 12.5% having had the booster. And we were told that vaccines would reduce severe illnesses, but we've had a record number of seriously ill people. The government says that the answer is more boosters given at shorter intervals. But considering what we're seeing at the moment, do you have confidence that these boosters are going to be any helpful?
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me on. Yes, since July of this year, that's 5 months after starting our national vaccination campaign, we have been seeing a significant increase in the number of breakthrough infections. However, ever since we started our booster campaign, that number of breakthrough infections has gone down significantly. From previously, it was 180,000 per 100,000 vaccinations were breakthrough cases. And since delivering third shot boosters, that number has gone down to 17 per 100,000 cases. We know from laboratory data that delivering a booster will increase antibody levels, will increase T-cell responses. So yes, I am confident that delivering boosters will help us fight the pandemic and will eventually save lives. We should note that since delivering boosters, third shot boosters, there's only been one severe case of a breakthrough infection, and there have been no fatalities reported after a breakthrough infection case subsequent to a booster dose, third shot booster.
Okay, and this next question is a topic of a lot of controversy here in South Korea and in many other countries around the world. It's about the vaccine pass system. Suyo mentioned around 81% of people in South Korea have been fully vaccinated, but that means still a fifth of people here have not had a vaccine or aren't fully vaccinated. And as a result of these mandates where you can't go to a restaurant, you can't go to a cafe, you can't go to the cinema, if they're not fully vaccinated, it kind of almost lends itself to unvaccinated people being kind of like second-class citizens. Now, where do you stand on an ethical level on this? And are we at a point now where this is going just a little bit too far?
Well, so, 10 million people have not received COVID-19 vaccinations in our country. COVID-19 still causes severe disease in 2% of everyone infected. So if we do the math, that's 200,000 cases of severe disease that we can anticipate from this population of unvaccinated people. I do not want to see 200,000 more ICU cases due to COVID-19. What this means for our country is the pandemic will be prolonged. There will continue to be increased deaths due to COVID-19, and our country will continue to suffer the overwhelming collateral hardships of this pandemic because of this large pool of unvaccinated people. And so basically our country will be, I hate to say it, but held hostage because of this pool of people who refuse to get vaccinated. So what do we need to do? We need to make more effort to try to convince people who are hesitant about getting vaccinations. We need to make sure that the process is facilitated for them. We need to make sure that they get all the information that they need so they can get vaccinated with confidence. And I think that's the type of effort that we need to make, because the numbers, they tell us what direction we're heading in if we don't do a better job convincing people on the fence to go ahead and get their vaccinations. Already 6.3 million people have gotten their third shot. Of course, I'm grateful to every single one of them for doing their duty. And really, vaccination is what's going to help us get through the pandemic. And we have to do this before the Omicron variant becomes more widespread. And of course, we still need to wait several months before an oral antiviral pill will be available, which will help. But that's still in the future.
Well, many parents are also opposed to giving their children vaccine, but the government is, of course, now pushing to vaccinate more and more teenagers. And while the health ministry says that 51,000 teenagers have had the virus, but 0 have died. So we keep hearing that it's to protect other segments of the population, the elderly. But then some parents may ask why they should put strangers over their own kids. I mean, what do you make of this, Dr. Tan?
Well, 3 children between the ages of 0 and 10 have died due to COVID-19. There's a child between the age of 10 and 19 who is in the ICU right now due to COVID-19. So it's not just about protecting other people. It's about protecting your own child against severe acute COVID-19 disease. It's about preventing potential long-term effects of long COVID, which could potentially affect the brain, affect the heart, And we don't know when long-haul COVID ends. And I would hate for a parent of a child to have the child suffer from long-term consequences of a potentially preventable disease just because they chose not to get vaccinated. And it's also about, protecting entire communities and getting our society back on track to leading, pre-COVID life. And so there are many, many compelling reasons for why we need to convince adolescents and children later when the vaccine is approved in younger age groups to get vaccinated. It's not just about other people, it's about protecting children as well and keeping schools open.
Yeah, well, some parents might counter that by saying we don't know the long-term effects of these vaccines because they've only been out a couple of years and haven't been tested on animals and things like that. But finally, I just want to touch upon Omicron. It's been the dominant variant in South Africa now for quite a while. But according to the latest data, I know it can change, but hospitalizations there have dropped to their lowest level in quite a while. And some experts are saying that potentially if Omicron becomes the dominant strain, this could potentially be some kind of blessing in disguise.
I disagree with that. If you look at the statistics from the South African National Institute of Communicable Diseases, the average number of daily hospitalizations due to COVID-19 has actually gone up tenfold from November 8th to this most recent week. And so we would, I'm just imagining what would happen in Korea if our hospitalizations due to COVID-19 went up tenfold. I mean, it would be a horrific situation. They went up from an average of 38 COVID-19 hospitalizations a day to 380 admissions on average per day since the spread of the Omicron variant. And so it really is a serious situation in South Africa. It is true that their case fatality ratio has not gone up proportionately, but the number of cases due to COVID-19 has also soared. On December 9th, they logged more than 22,000 cases of COVID-19. But we should remember on November 8th, right before Omicron took off, they were having 116 cases of COVID-19 per day. That steep rise in daily new cases has been quite remarkable, and we do not want to see the same type of pattern happen in our country. We do need to wait in terms of the virulence, finding out how severe the illnesses will be. But the increase in hospitalizations, I think that is enough to make us worried and to make sure we stay vigilant.
Dr. Alice Tan, as always, we're very grateful for your insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, moving on, President Moon Jae-in arrived in Australia late Sunday for a 4-day state visit. The trip comes as Seoul and Canberra mark 60 years of diplomatic relations this year. First on his itinerary, a summit with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
They're expected to discuss bolstering cooperation in carbon neutrality and the hydrogen economy. For this, our senior Blue House correspondent Kim Min-ji reports from Canberra.
Bolstering cooperation in green energy and future high-tech industries is expected to top the agenda when President Moon Jae-in holds a summit with Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison on Monday. Moon arrived in Canberra a day earlier for a 4-day state visit. He is the first foreign leader to visit the country since it shut down borders in 2020, and is the first South Korean president to make a state visit to Australia in 12 years. The Blue House says the leaders will discuss cooperation in the fields of carbon neutrality, hydrogen economy, defense, space, and cyber technology. On the occasion of Moon's visit, South Korea and Australia will also formally elevate their relationship to comprehensive strategic partnership, especially as this year marks 6 decades of diplomatic ties. Moon and Morrison have already met twice this year, on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rome in October and G7 in Cornwall in June. Another goal of Moon's visit is to secure a stable supply of raw materials and key mining products. South Korea sees Australia as a potential partner for battery minerals such as lithium and essential minerals necessary for future industries such as electric cars. Last month, Australia also provided urea solution to South Korea to ease a local shortage caused by China's tightened urea exports. South Korea is Australia's fourth largest trading partner, while Canberra is Seoul's eighth largest. Also on Monday, President Moon will pay respects at the Australian National Korean War Memorial and have dinner with Australian veterans of the 1950-53 Korean War.
Through Moon's visit, the Blue House expects to expand the horizon for cooperation between South Korea and Australia based on their complementary industrial structures. It also hopes to drum up support for the Korean Peninsula peace process. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News, Canberra.
At a G7 meeting in the UK over the weekend, the top diplomats of South Korea and Japan met face-to-face for the first time. However, during their brief chat over dinner, South Korean officials said they merely reaffirmed the sizable gap between the two countries over historical issues. Yoon Jung-min reports.
South Korean Foreign Minister Chung Eui-yong and his Japanese counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi met for the first time on the sidelines of the G7 ministerial meeting in the UK, only to reaffirm a frosty Seoul-Tokyo relationship over historical issues. Seoul's foreign ministry says they briefly met at a reception over the weekend, and Chung made clear the Korean government's stance on Korean victims of wartime forced labor and sexual slavery. Chung called for dialogue, adding the two countries have a lot to work on together. Japan's Kyodo News reported that Hayashi demanded, quote, appropriate measures from South Korea regarding the thorny issues, reiterating Japan's earlier stance. They have agreed to continue close communication between Seoul and Tokyo. On North Korea, the two ministers confirmed the importance of cooperation, along with the U.S., for the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese foreign minister only took office last month, and the two officials had begun the reception by exchanging friendly greetings. It has also been reported that the South Korean chief diplomat met his U.S. counterpart Antony Blinken at the G7. There's a possibility that they will hold a separate meeting on bilateral issues and matters related to the Korean Peninsula, including on ways to resume talks with North Korea. Earlier, Blinken met Hayashi and they reaffirmed the importance of trilateral cooperation with South Korea for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. South Korea was invited to the expanded G7 ministerial meeting, along with Australia and the ASEAN, amid intensifying tension between Western nations and China and Russia. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Foreign ministers from the G7 are putting up a united front over the simmering Russia-Ukraine tensions, warning Moscow that it will face severe consequences if Russian forces launch an attack on their smaller neighbour. The G7 also issued a warning to China for what it called Beijing's coercive economic policies. Kim Da-mi reports.
Russia will face massive consequences and severe costs if President Vladimir Putin attacks Ukraine. That's according to G7 delegates who warned in a statement on Sunday that they were united in their condemnation of Moscow's military buildup near Ukraine, urging Russia to de-escalate.
We've been clear that any incursion by Russia into Ukraine would have massive consequences for which there would be a severe cost.
Reaffirming their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, the G7 foreign ministers further pledged to intensify their cooperation under a common and comprehensive response without giving specifics. The G7 members also expressed their concerns about the, quote, coercive economic policies of China. They have long sketched on the development finance initiative to counter China's increasing financial influence on developing countries such as in Africa. After calling out China in a joint statement for the first time in June, the delegates said Sunday they reaffirmed their pledges and stances issued in that statement. Speaking at a G7 news conference in Liverpool, the British Foreign Secretary said the delegates want to build the investment and economic trade reach of like-minded, freedom-loving democracies in a message directed at Beijing. Also included in Sunday's statement was North Korea, where the foreign ministers urged Pyongyang to restrain provocations and instead engage in diplomatic procedures, echoing the joint statement issued at the G7 Foreign and Development Ministers meeting in May. The G7 also pressed Iran to agree a deal to curb its nuclear ambitions, underlining resumed talks in Vienna were the last chance for negotiations. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Stability is poised to be the main focus of China's economic policy in 2022. This is according to a senior economic official of the Chinese Communist Party, who said China's economic policymakers attending the annual tone-setting Central Economic Work Conference stressed that stabilizing growth over the next 12 months is a top priority. Stability was mentioned 25 times in the 5,000-word statement issued following the meeting. They also noted the three-pronged pressure facing the Chinese economy, namely shrinking demand, supply shocks, and weakening expectations. Inflows into exchange-traded funds surpassed $1 trillion for the first time this year, surpassing last year's $735 billion. The record figure was achieved at the end of November and comes on the back of a record 380 ETFs launched in the US alone in 2021. Currently, the amount of funds in ETF assets stands at nearly $9.5 trillion, more than double the amount that it was at the end of 2018. Experts say rising stock markets and a lack of high-yield alternatives prompted investors to turn to ETFs in greater numbers.
Now it's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Last week, US President Joe Biden held a virtual summit hosting more than 100 world leaders, civil society activists and journalists to discuss and renew shared values and resolve to strengthen democracy amid a rise of authoritarianism around the globe. But as the US leader admitted, democracy starts at home, and recent years have been challenging times for societies. Before and after the summit, critics have questioned whether the summit would motivate governments to get back on track or simply cause more division in the world. To discuss this, we connect with Chae-Tong Kim, professor at Seogang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Mark Shanahan, associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of Reading. A warm welcome to you both. And, well, to begin with you, Professor Kim, the Summit for Democracy held last week. It faced criticism before it even opened, with the guest list being quite controversial. It included the likes of Brazil, India, and the Philippines, whose leaders have arguably caused democracy to backslide in recent years. And, well, despite the criticism, though, what was the reason that President Biden held the summit and invited these rather controversial guests?
Sure. There was criticism, as you said. There are just too many countries that don't really qualify as being democratic. You just mentioned Brazil, India, and the Philippines, but still you can say that these countries are at least partly democratic. But Angola was invited, so was Congo. You know, in my personal opinion, these countries are not democratic at all. And in case of Eastern Europe, Poland was in, but Hungary was out. So a lot of people are scratching their heads. You know, what's the criteria here? It's just too arbitrary. But I think you'll have to look at it this way, because the status of democracy in the world is very precarious. You know, democracy is in retreat all around the world, and this is quite alarming, because in the early 1990s, when the Cold War was over, the world had witnessed what is known as third wave of democratization. You know, many countries went through democratization. In the early 2000s, we had another wave of democracy. There is Arab Spring, but since then, democracy has been in decline. The number of democracies is in decline, and the quality of democracy is decline. And this doesn't really bode well for President Biden, who wants to resuscitate the liberal democratic order, liberal international order. So in a way, Biden, I think, is trying to steer these quasi-democracies and illiberal democracies into the path of more stable and mature democratization. That said, I still think that the criticism is very valid. You look at the list of these countries, you feel that Biden was selling democracy short.
And well, Professor Kim, few expected Russia or China to make the list, but they did seem a bit offended all the same. Do you think the holding of the summit is going to deepen America's rift with these countries?
Oh, absolutely. China and Russia, they just didn't take it very well. In fact, China issued a white paper. I forgot the name of the paper, but there China claims that China has its own political system, which is democratic. It's just different from the Western participatory or electoral democracy. Well, Soo-young, we just talked about the decline of democracy, right? Many believe that the decline of democracy has a lot to do with the rise of China and the relative decline of the United States. China is now mounting ideological campaign to spread authoritarianism as the Soviet Union did to spread communism all around the world. But I think China is still trying to make the world safe for autocracies. China is trying to make the world where autocrats and autocracies feel legitimate or even privileged. And the U.S., on its own part, lost interests in its policy to promote democracy. This trend was quite noticeable during the presidency of Donald Trump. So I think Biden wants to right the ship here. He wants to change the course. He's trying to, take care of democracy at home, and he's also trying to bring more democracies together. And this is a very efficient way to deal with the threats associated with the rise of China.
Well, Professor Shanahan, now, before Britain hosted the extended G7 meeting in June, it also proposed initiatives to strengthen democracies, such as the D10 group. The integrated review as well, it also commits to spreading democracy in the world. And then, of course, next year, there's the Copenhagen Democracy Summit coming up in June. So with these various initiatives, what was the purpose of President Biden hosting his own democracy summit?
Yeah, we do like bandying around the term democracy, and Western leaders and Biden as a relatively new president definitely wants to get behind this. And it has been a terrible year. The last couple of years have been a terrible time for democracy. We look at the Freedom Index and see far more countries slipping back towards autocracy than actually moving towards democracy. Not helped at all by 4 years of Donald Trump, where the US just abdicated its global leadership. So I would say Biden had three aims with this meeting that he held last week. First of all, to push back against autocracy. We know he'd had long calls with Putin, that he's had contact with Xi in China, trying to establish relations with them, but also to make it very clear to them that no longer were they free to act as they wanted to without America pushing back, interfering, getting involved. So that was aim number one. Aim number two was just to re-establish that United States leadership within international relations. It's been abdicated for too long. Biden, frankly, hasn't had a very good year of it himself. And now he is trying to do something of a reset with a group of countries that he feels America can have influence with. This is why it was a relatively select group. And finally, don't forget the midterms are not far off in America. He is also talking to a domestic audience at home. The January 6th insurrection is being investigated through congressional hearings at the moment. Here is a president who wants to be seen to be standing up for democracy, completely at odds and opposite to his predecessor.
Professor Shanahan, Mr. Biden, he also intends to hold a second summit of democracies next year. And while critics have said that this summit, the first one, it's really going to intensify division rather than strengthen unity among democratic countries. What's your opinion on this?
I think there has to be action that comes from this first summit. Whether it be G7, G20, all of these other meetings that we've heard an awful lot of this year, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. So if there are concrete plans that come from the United States, which is putting a lot of money into this initiative, if we see them play out in Africa, in Asia, in South America, even in Poland, Hungary, Slovenia, those countries that are backtracking on democracy in Europe, then a second summit will be justified. They can't go back to beginnings and talk about all of the nice things that they'd like to do. They have to show through participation that action is happening that is strengthening democracy. If it doesn't, it raises the case, maybe for the alternative view, as Professor Kim has already alluded to, of the kind of benign autocracy that China would like to promote. Now, is China's move, is Russia's move, is it benign autocracy? Is it for the benefit of the Commonwealth of Nations, or is it something a little more totalitarian and a little more favouring those one or two countries? Biden would like to have a much stronger network of democracies that start pushing the freedom index in the right direction again. And to do that, he has to counter, frankly, the attraction of China.
And well, Professor Kim, in terms of getting more countries on Washington's side in its rivalry with Beijing, do you think the emphasis on democracy as a foreign policy is going to work well for the United States? I mean, especially among countries in ASEAN.
But I think the U.S. is in dilemmatic situation here. Democracy and human rights are important parts of Biden's value democracy, right? And democracy and human rights are China's source parts, and you want to exploit them. And at the same time, you want to bring as many countries as you can to your side in this fight against China, right? And the most important battleground in this U.S.-China competition is over Southeast Asia, over ASEAN countries. I think these are real battleground states, and then China has an overwhelming advantage here because of geographical proximity. So in order for the United States to prevail in Southeast Asia, it's very important for the U.S. to win the hearts and minds of ASEAN countries. And therein lies the dilemma for the United States, because if you push democracy and human rights too far, you're not going to win the hearts and minds of ASEAN countries, because many ASEAN countries have dismal record of democracy and human rights, to be honest with you. And if you ignore democracy and human rights in your policy to ASEAN, if you remain silent about human rights issues and democracy issues in ASEAN, people will say that Biden's value democracy is selective in nature. Biden's value democracy goes to China, but it stops in ASEAN countries. So Biden, I think, will really have to somehow navigate the middle ground here. That's my take.
Well, Professor Kim, the US, of course, it's been pushing for countries to come up with these deliverables before the second summit next year. And it announced the presidential initiative for democratic renewal, and then it also joined hands with the likes of Australia, Denmark and Norway to announce this export control program. And that's designed to ensure that technology isn't used to violate human rights. And well, according to the Voice of America, the United States government is giving other countries until January to make their own pledges and wants to see progress on such deliverables. What is the reason for this kind of pressure?
Well, to me, I think there is very little doubt that the U.S. had China in mind when they floated this idea. It's no secret that CCP is utilizing all sorts of surveillance technologies to monitor Uyghurs in Xinjiang and to monitor even ordinary citizens in China. Simply put, there is no free flow of information in China, no freedom of speech. And this information and communication technology has become an important policy tool of CCP. In Xinjiang, as I said, spyware, all these technologies are now the most important tools to abuse the most basic rights of Uyghurs, including the right to move freely in their own country. To me, it's quite alarming because when the internet and smartphone and SNS, when they started to spread like bushfire all around the world, we believe that ICT, information and communication technology, would empower people over the government, because people now have instant access to this important information and share it with others, virtually real time. However, in many authoritarian countries, ICT, information and communication technology, has worked to the advantage of these authoritarian regimes. These regimes that are gagging freedom of speech. And we'll have to put an end to this, really. So that I think that is the reason why Biden and other democracies are launching this export control regime thing together to restrict the spread of technologies that are being used to abuse human rights.
Professor Shanahan, Mr. Biden raised the issue of electoral systems, and the summit closed with a focus on strengthening cooperation on export control and human rights to ensure that technology doesn't fall into the hands of authoritarian governments. And while keeping government systems free and democratic and representative is very important, we're also seeing the rise of the growing presence, rather, of big tech companies, as well as the worsening income levels, disproportionate income levels. Some would say that these are more direct threats to democracies. Do you think these issues should be addressed in any upcoming discussions?
It's very notable that this first dialogue that Biden brought together included some big tech companies. These companies in themselves have economies larger than many of the countries that took place in this summit. A company like Facebook turns over more than almost half of the states in the world. We can't live without them. The problem is that they're run by unelected boards, that founders of any of these companies have had free rein for rather a long time to build their own systems, their own platforms, their own governance that is largely untouched by the governments of countries where they operate. That balance is wrong at the moment, and it goes hand in hand with this systematic situation we have at the moment where the rich are getting exponentially richer and the poor aren't. They aren't getting any better off at all. Now, actually, the kind of democracy envisaged coming out of the Second World War with the institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, and all of the rest were built upon a foundation of United Nations that worked together for mutual benefit, where the wealthy countries of the world raised up those who were less wealthy. It could be that the big tech companies enable that to happen. But at the moment, we're not necessarily seeing that. And that remains in itself a danger to the further spread of democracy.
Well, it looks like democracies have a long way to go to get back on track. But for today, we're going to have to end the discussion here. That was Chae-Chong Kim, Professor at Seogang University's Graduate School of International Studies, and Mark Shanahan, Associate Professor in Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The death toll from a huge tornado that swept across 6 US states keeps rising as rescue work continues round the clock to search for survivors who may be trapped under the rubble of destroyed buildings. Kentucky was the hardest hit, and authorities there fear the death toll could top 100. Kim Hyo-sun with more.
Rescuers worked through the night searching for survivors from what could be the longest tornado in U.S. history that left a trail of destruction across 6 states from Arkansas to Kentucky. Hardest hit was Kentucky, where streets were left turned in rubble and debris from collapsed buildings. Authorities say that despite emergency warnings, the size and power of the tornado was devastating.
There were lots of warnings, and in fact, even at that factory, there was a warning for people to get to the right area. But this storm, it's like nothing any of us have ever seen before, even in a movie or on TV. It is that devastating. I mean, homes totally gone, and the people inside them totally gone too. This is something so devastating. The warnings were there. I don't fault anybody for that.
Dozens of people are still unaccounted for in Kentucky, where at least 100 people were believed to have been killed. The powerful twisters destroyed a candle factory, as well as fire and police stations in a small town in Kentucky, ripped through a nursing home in neighboring Missouri, and killed at least 6 workers at an Amazon warehouse in Illinois. According to AFP, over 70,000 people are left without power in Tennessee. President Joe Biden has approved an emergency disaster declaration for Kentucky and vowed to support other states affected by the tornado.
But whatever is needed, it's within the authority of the President of the United States and the federal government to provide that help. And we're going to provide whatever is needed.
The storm was all the more remarkable because it came in December, as colder weather normally limits tornadoes. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
The weekend that has just passed marked the 25th anniversary of South Korea joining the OECD. Becoming a member of the organisation was truly a milestone for South Korea, and ever since then, the country's economy has come along leaps and bounds. But that was then, and this is now. So what does the future of the relationship hold going forward? Kim Sang-min reports.
Exactly 25 years ago in 1996, South Korea became a member state of the OECD based on 3 decades of dramatic economic growth. In that time, the country had grown its GDP per capita by 123-fold, an achievement dubbed the Miracle on the Han River.
Here in the middle of Seoul is the Han River. The Miracle on the Han River changed the area behind me from muddy ground to highways and skyscrapers in a few short years. But after such dramatic growth, the next question was how to keep it going.
In that task, South Korea had a partner in the OECD. There, South Korea could learn from its fellow member states to figure out what types of reform will work best as it moved towards a market economy.
This involved a greater exposure to competitive forces, better governance for financial institutions and corporates, as well as a more flexible labor market coupled with a stronger social protection.
And in the 25 years since then, South Korea has proven that the so-called miracle was not a fluke. It's now Asia's 4th largest economy, with a GDP that's grown another 2.7 times as of 2020 to $1.6 trillion. Last year, its exports were the world's 7th largest. But while South Korea has come a long way, the journey's far from over. In the background of this dramatic growth are some of the most pressing issues, like an extraordinarily low birth rate. The country's total fertility rate has been steadily decreasing to a new all-time low last year of 0.84, the lowest in the OECD. Gender inequality was a serious concern back in 1996 and is still lists today, South Korea having the OECD's biggest gender wage gap. So what does the country's path forward look like in the next 25 years?
As far as social issues are concerned, the Nordic European economies are perhaps a good example to get inspiration from, because they have achieved flexicurity, which means combining a more flexible labor market and a less dualistic labor market than the one in Korea, with a higher degree of social protection than is offered right now in Korea.
Now, what about the people? How do they want to shape the next 25 years? They generally agree on one thing.
I hope that in 25 years, South Korea will have equality.
Equality, because even as a grown-up person myself, I can sense that young people and teenagers are not given fair opportunities.
I just want to tell other young people in my generation, those who will lead the country in the future, not to give up, because we will have our time to shine.
Kim Sang-min, Arirang News.
Good morning. The coldest day of the season is here. The air is nothing like last week, with a cold wave advisory issued across much of Korea. Morning lows in Seoul are below -5 degrees Celsius, and of course, Daegwallyeong is much colder, below -10. And a sharp wind is making things colder than these actual temperatures, so we need to bundle up tight from head to toe. Southern provinces are also waking up to sub-zero temperatures under a cold wave advisory that includes Daegu and even Busan. Mostly sunny skies will be featured for most of the day except on Jeju Island. Air quality, though, will be good nationwide, and highs will be 2 to 5 degrees Celsius lower than Sunday. So Seoul will go up to 3 degrees, Gwangju, Gyeongju going up to just 5 degrees this afternoon, so please stay warm. This round of cold snap will be short-lived, though, as the cold will ease tomorrow afternoon. Rain is in the forecast in the midweek, then it's going to get colder again as we head towards the weekend. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the world.
That's all we have for now. We'll be back at 8 a.m. Korea time on Tuesday for our next edition of New Day at Arirang. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm Oh Soo-young.
Yes, thank you for joining us. We'll be back at the same time all this week. And a reminder that in about 25 minutes from now, I'll be back in the studio to bring you live coverage of that post-summit press conference between the leaders of South Korea and Australia. Until next time, goodbye.